Well, I've got a special guest today, Dr. Tom Guilliams. He earned his doctorate in molecular immunology from the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And for the past 2 decades, he's spent his time investigating the mechanisms and actions of lifestyle and nutrient-based therapies, and he's an expert in therapeutic uses of dietary supplements. Tom serves as an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy and is VP of Science for Orthomolecular Products. Since 2014, he's been writing a series of teaching manuals or roadmaps which outline and evaluate the evidence and principles and protocols that are fundamental to functional and integrative medical community. He's the founder and director of the Point Institute, an independent research publishing organization that distributes many of his publications and his research articles. His wonderful book, The Original Prescription, is where I first got into Dr. Guilliams' work, and he joins me today on the Memory Health Made Easy podcast. Dr. Tom, thank you very much for joining me today. G'day, this is David Norris, and this is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, brought to you by memoryhealthmadeeasy.com. Easy to remember, isn't it? How aware are you of your body's signals? Do you know what they are? Do you know what you should be responding to? Well, today's guest talks about how we can understand the rich symphony of our body signals so that we can make better decisions about maintaining our health and preventing disease. Our guest today really is the quiet achiever. The person, as he self-describes, goes underground and has been quietly working away, but his work has been loud. It's resonated with many communities. It has influenced the thinking of others dramatically. So much so that I was first aware of his work by one of the key leaders and exponents of lifestyle medicine from the United States. He challenges us today by asking questions around, are we doing the best we can? Is this truly the best approach that we can apply to improving our health? And in our conversation today, and through his work, he offers rich, detailed, and evidence support on ways that we can make changes in our lives that can prevent, heal, and yes, even reverse chronic diseases. That's a really big promise. And in today's show, we go behind the curtain of lifestyle medicine and have a really good look at why it works, how it works, and what you can do in your life, in your patients' lives, to make it stick and apply it. So join me in today's conversation with Dr. Tom Guilliams, a fascinating conversation, one which I've been looking forward to a very long time, and I'm super grateful that he's joined me on today's show. So let's get to it.
This is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, the show where you learn practical tips and experts share advice on what you can do to boost your brain span to match your lifespan. Now to the host of the show, David Norris.
Dr. Tom Guilliams, thank you very much for joining me on the Memory Health Made Easy podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on the call today. Dr. Tom, as I mentioned in our conversation before we launched into this, we Australians have a tendency to shorten names, and I think I can point the finger at my convict heritage in this, but were you okay for me to reference you in this conversation as Tom? And that'll make my tongue-tying moments a lot less.
That's fine. And I've been to Australia twice, and I've never met a convict, so we're okay.
Well, you can find us in the street a lot. Tom, I was introduced to your work some years ago by Dr. David Ferris, who at the time I think was the chair of the American Lifestyle Medicine Association. I might have that name wrong, but at the time he was chairing that particular body, and he introduced me to your lifestyle synergy model, which for me at the time resonated so deeply around how I was working with my clients with cognitive changes. And one of the things that really stood out for me in diving deeper into your work, and my first point of entry was the Original Prescription, your publication there, which is an excellent book. And what what opened up the story around lifestyle synergy was your interest in this space. And I thought it'd be wonderful for us to start there about what's drawn you into having such a committed but also detailed focus on understanding the human condition and also looking at how it interacts with the world.
So yeah, that's a big question. But I as it turns out, I got my PhD when as a young man. I was interested in biology and kind of how the world works, and I loved reading and the whole area of biology. And I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in the United States here in Wisconsin in biology and chemistry. And then I went on in the mid 90s I started in the early 90s getting my PhD in molecular biology. So very intensive. It was kind of a new research area at the time, or emerging area at the time, and never thinking I would maybe end up where I am today, of course. But early on, after I graduated with my PhD, I was actually asked to come into a dietary supplement company, actually, that serviced healthcare professionals in the United States. And so it was early on. It was a very small company, but because of my interest, I immediately started jumping into learning about herbs and vitamins, minerals, and along with that, interacting with hundreds and hundreds of clinicians who obviously saw things differently than maybe the traditional way of looking at it, asking different questions. So I had a lot of the questions they were directing to me, asked me those questions. And so from a curiosity standpoint, just started digging in and asking my own questions and trying to answer theirs. And then looking at all the connections between a number of the integrative medicine, alternative medicine, functional medicine, all the different types of groups were out there, including herbalists and other things that were diving into this. And so I started looking at these things, not only from the traditional perspective of those modalities, but also the research literature. So it was just about that time that PubMed became available. So, getting access to all kinds of literature made it much easier to start asking questions. And then it's just started snowballing from there. As I've been interacting with a number of these groups in the United States, the groups that teach clinicians, functional medicine, integrative medicine, anti-aging medicine, all these different terms. I think you mentioned, I think it was David Ferris, who then requested, I think, some slides from me so that he could bring them there. So it's kind of gone wider than that. During those early years, I was doing a lot of writing of monographs. So I would write a monograph on, let's say, an integrative approach or a natural approach to treat, BPH or diabetes or something like that. And after about 17, 18 years of doing it, I decided I want to put sort of my thinking down in larger manuscripts and textbooks. But before doing that for clinicians, because for the most part, clinicians were my audience, I sort of wanted to back up and say, okay, all this is based on sort of this premise of the intrinsic healing properties of the human body, and lifestyle medicine at its base. Really, all the other modalities are trying to trigger the natural healing process of the body. So I kind of put a pause and I said, I want to read a book first before I get into all my technical textbooks on sort of what is my, sort of put a stake in the ground. What is my view of the human condition, the ability of the human body to heal, and what I call the signals of life that are there to restore or rebuild or maintain those healing capacities. And that's where I came up with, that's what I called the original prescription, because the idea was all of these lifestyle signals are originally designed to trigger the healing capacity. And then from there, I started writing a series of textbooks, which I've got 5 different textbooks sort of designed to flesh it out and go into more detail for various conditions. But anyway, so that's how I got into this. After 24 years now, I still love this. I'm still updating my books and getting into the literature all the time. So I really think that, as you know, that this is an area that we need to continue to get out and have people leverage the knowledge that we've learned.
I think the thing that really resonated with me in opening up the original prescription was that the messages that our body takes in is really from our lifestyle and our environment, and it converts that into health or disease. And that was I think for me, just a really distilling down that for many people, we'll wander our lives around thinking that our behavior is okay for our health. Yet this subtle changes that build up over time has been the body's ability to try and compensate for our choices, compensate for our environment, and at some point gets us into a state where things are showing us the alarm bells that it's now moved out into a different behavior state. One of the things that you referenced in the original prescription was tilting the hat, I think, to Professor Bruce Ames's work on the triage aspect, or the triage theory, which is, that the body will prioritize certain mechanisms, certain behaviors, certain cellular performances over others, and therefore we start to see change over time. But you took it further than that, and obviously tip the hat to Professor Ames's work, but you went further than that with your observation around lifestyle synergy.
Yeah, Dr. Ames's work was more on looking at certain nutrients and how the cells prioritize certain nutrients when they're in a stressful situation. But I think that theory, that idea, the triage idea, that there's sort of a priority. The body knows what is the most important thing, and when we get into the stress response, we'll see that that's really true of the stress response. We're trying to stay alive today so that we can deal with tomorrow's new stresses. We can't deal with, things that are, for instance, let's think of like bone mineral density. That's a long-term metabolic process. The body can scrap that for today if it needs to survive the next 10 minutes or the next 20 minutes. So it's not surprising that stress actually depletes the bones of some of its minerals so that it can deal with other things. Or even glucose sensitivity. It doesn't matter. The brain needs glucose now. It doesn't matter if the fat cells become insulin resistant because I need glucose in the next 10, 20 minutes. And unfortunately, what we do, and maybe this is the way of thinking of many people, younger people are thinking, I can sleep when I want. I can stay up as late as I want. I can eat whatever I want. I can not worry about these things. And somehow my body will compensate. Well, when you have a lot of physiological resilience and reserve, it doesn't seem to affect you. And so the next day you say, well, I did all those things and I'm okay. The problem is, like you mentioned, it's that accumulative effect. So as the body is letting you deal with your mistakes today, there's a little bit of payment that you don't see that's going on. And it takes a while to accumulate. And depending on your genetics, depending on other factors, it may catch up to you sooner or later, depending on those other factors. And of course, most of these things are a little bit more difficult to reverse than they are to maintain.
And I think that strikes at the heart of how you describe that process over time, is that you've got opportunities to intervene along that life course or that exposure course to, let's say, an experience of stress or dietary choices where you are amplifying the amount of sugar in your body, etc. And then over time, there is a capacity of the body to maintain that normal course. But then there is a point where it's starting to get more of those difficulties to maintain that sugar regulation. And that might be what we would say is pre-diabetes, or maybe the indicators for metabolic syndrome. Right. And then we're moving closer towards an experience of diabetes at I guess, the end point of that continuum with all host of changes in the body. Now, if we're going to respond to each of those points along that timeline, obviously the best energy is going to be earlier rather than later.
Right. One of the analogies that I use is the idea of a rubber band or a spring. And I think everybody can realize that, you can stretch a rubber band and it'll come back. It's what I call physiological resilience. Every component of the body, every cellular process is not intended to be static, like homeostatic, but it's intended to be changed and then come back, changed and then come back. It's a homeodynamic kind of response. Well, what happens is, like a rubber band, you keep stretching, and you don't have necessarily all the capacity to bring that back. Now you have a compromised system. And so the body has all these buffering systems to protect itself. But if you stretch each one, and you don't rebuild, then you start seeing that. And the classic example, as you mentioned, is blood sugar. So the area of the curve, we call it, after you eat a meal goes up and then comes back down. But as you get more and more glucose intolerant or impaired glucose tolerance, that gets higher and doesn't come back as quickly. It goes higher and doesn't come back as quickly. And all that time period that glucose is high is then changing physiology. We call it glycation, but there's other factors going on. So it's subtle and you don't maybe notice it, but as it accumulates month after month, year after year, then we see the consequences.
It's something that I often think about, almost like, you're the orchestra of a large ensemble, and you've got everything in harmony, but somebody just starts to get a little bit out of kilter, and we're starting to get just a subtle change in the crystallizing of sound, and that then pervades other timing in the group and other timing, which is across fields, and all of a sudden there's a starting to change that if we take a very mechanistic or mechanical view, the gears start to grind, and there's not a lot of harmony, a lot of friction within the system. Tom, I'm wondering if you could maybe highlight then, if we're going to start to attend to this in our own bodies, in our own lives, what are the key pillars around the lifestyle model that you've created that you think folk need to be vigilant and attentive to? What are those areas? And I think there are 7 areas from memory around the lifestyle synergy model.
Right. So when I started thinking about what I call signals, the signals of life, they come in all these different areas. Obviously, we could list thousands and thousands, almost literally everything. You're drinking water right now. That's a signal. We're communicating here. I've got lights above me. All these things are signals. And so I decided that, we need to divide them. If you're going to teach somebody, train them, or you're going to educate them on how to know where these signals are coming from, you start creating a system. So as you mentioned, and I'm just leafing through my book here to you probably have the figure you can probably show to your audience at some point where we look at the signals. And the 7 areas that I think that you want to think about is diet and nutrition. So obviously it's a huge area. We consume somewhere between 40 and 50 tons of food in our lifetimes, and that would be 2,000 pounds of ton. And think about all of those nutrients, not just the calories, but all the phytonutrients, all the compounds. And if you're eating non-organic, you're eating a lot of other toxins and other exposures, which we might think about elsewhere. But other category, physical activity, and this would include just anything physical, anything exercise would be classic, but anything physical activity, even sitting, sedentariness or lack of sitting is a signal. The stress response, I think, really is a unique set of signals. So I kind of categorize those separately. And so and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. Another category, the 4th category, I put as circadian or chronicity, or things that are cyclical in. So circadian rhythm is hard to diminish how important circadian rhythm, but it's also weekly, monthly, and of course lifetime kind of rhythms. Another set of signals are those that are outside the body. So I consider them environmental, outside. Those can be good signals or bad. So sunlight, there's some very good signals that come from the sun, maybe some bad signals that if we're overdoing the sun. But I consider also the gut microbe that we have, the microbiome of our own gut, is really outside of our body. So that also is something that we need to think about as something external. And then the last 2 are what I call habit, so that you have these sort of hygiene and habit factors. Obviously, there's a crossover between some of these other things. And then the idea of purpose and community. So there's a lot of signals that come, and we know how powerful, relationships can be. And we now can look at actually the way relationships turn on, turn off, genes and signals in the body, hormones and things like that. So this isn't, the definitive 7 categories, but it's the 7 categories that I use to help divide them. And it's pretty hard to find a signal that affects our body that doesn't fit into one of those 7. And it follows somewhat, a lot of the way that other groups have divided up these signals, maybe not exactly, but so that's really the 7 areas. And obviously there's synergy between them. So you can't just isolate them. They're not silos. They're just a sort of a way to teach and understand these groups of signals.
In my work with folk, what I'll often do is sometimes, if I've got the opportunity to be in a point in their lives that I'm connecting with them, that the disease process isn't at a point of significant chronicity where there is significant functional change. And when I mean the term functional for folk that are listening, that is, it's impacting my abilities to do everyday life, whether it's walking, getting out of a chair, whether it's being able to drive a car, whether it is able to plan and manage my finances, whether it's going to be something to impact my communication with loved ones. We can probably understand or appreciate that that's something I would see in folk who experience cognitive decline like dementia. But if I've got the opportunity to work with folk at the front end or early on, and that's often when I'm doing my speaking presentations and working with folk, I'll ask them to come at that lifestyle wheel with a sense of what interests you and do you have some curiosity to go with first, because it can be really overwhelming when we've got all these areas in our lives to think about those signals. Where can I start first on my journey? And then once I've started with 1, I can then move through to 2. But it's really important, and sometimes it's almost lost in our translation, that these things are interdependent. They are not separate, that the magic works in harmonizing or getting momentum across these different areas. And, for many of us, that sense of purpose, that sense of community. I was only speaking to somebody yesterday about the deterioration of, in Australia, we have a lot of communities that are built around local grassroots sporting communities. And I grew up in a generation where I could say my grandfather, was a founding member of, and that there was a long history of this. But there has been a splintering of that relationship to community, of that type of experience. And for some, there is church and faith, which fulfills that sort of sense of community and connection. But others will try and seek it in other areas. But I see that is one of the, poverties of experience in our lives at the moment, is around purpose and around how we connect with meaning and a sense of placement in this world. And pursuing that is going to have value.
I think, well, if you any of these 7 areas, you can't really isolate any of them. And eventually, if you neglect one too long, it will then impact most of the others. Because in the case of purpose, think about how many decisions someone makes to better their life or to choose one thing over another because of the relationships or the purpose they feel like they have for their family, for a larger community. It changes the way they think. I have this picture that I often use in one of my slide sets that shows a woman sitting eating a perfect salad, but you can tell her life is falling apart. And so she might be eating the perfect diet, but if her relations are messed up, if she has poor sleep or other factors going on, and she's eating alone, these kind of things in the middle of the night, she can't compensate for that just with the perfect salad or the perfect meal. And I think some people overcompensate in one area, but then they neglect sort of a balance of these other areas. And I think we saw that with bodybuilders for many years. They realize that you can work out so much, but unless you're sleeping right and eating right, you're not really helping your body in the long run. And so athletes have figured this out. And of course, there's a lot of psychology with athletes and understanding all those things go into performance. So you really can't neglect one area. But you could think of them as wedges, but I often think of them as sort of concentric circles. You don't have to start with each one at its maximum and figure out I need to maximize or perfect one of these, but you have to begin starting at them and kind of working your way out, looking at some of these things because they are going to begin affecting each other.
Yeah. Tom, I think that's a wonderful point to dive a little bit deeper around one of those areas that I know that really resonates with you, but perhaps is so unacknowledged in our current community, current environments, especially when we're working hard, we're maintaining families, we've got, at various life stages, whether you're a person living with a young family, whether your family has now moved out of home and you're now working towards a different goal, or you're in a point of life where your family are there around you, but you've also got those different requirements in your life, and there's a sense of busy and a sense of hustle, a sense of being overwhelmed with the daily experience of life. And it comes to a sense or an experience of stress. But stress, I think, is a term that gets thrown around without any ownership to self. How do you connect with folk with the term stress? Because, I think of many of my clients who have got existing cardiac conditions, type 2 diabetes, and will unpack, and it'll be clear for me that there is a stress experience that's happening around them. And their perception of or their interpretation of that into their bodies, into their world, into their understanding of how they be in their life is one which is engendering greater and greater stress. Yet if I was asked them to rate their sense of stress, they would still rate themselves as, well, not really that stressed. And I wonder if it's around that experience of, somebody's in the fishbowl, or the fish in the fishbowl observation, that I'm in the water and that my universe is defined by what's in the bowl, and I can't really see that experience. How do we get traction around the concept of stress? And how what's your observation on that?
So what I've taught, obviously I've written a lot about this. I wrote a mini textbook on, I think a lot about, when I think of stress, obviously from a biology standpoint, I'm thinking of the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, kind of, or what we might just say call the stress response. How does the body deal with the stressor? And there's some physiological factors that the brain perceives as stress, and we'll get into some of those. But when the question you're asking is, how does someone perceive themselves to be stressed? And what we've learned is, rather than asking somebody about, are you stressed? The questions that are best asked are, do you feel in control of? And then, do you feel in control of your finances? Do you feel like you're in control of the relationships around you? Because really, the ultimate sense of the perception of stress is, can I control the outcomes that I'm trying to control? And a lot of times, actually, if you ask somebody on the street, what is stress? Or if you are stressed, what is it? A lot of times it has to do with time or responsibilities, meaning I feel like I have a responsibility, but I'm not keep doing it. And so it stresses me. Or I feel like there's something I'm supposed to do and I can't get it done in enough time. Or somebody has an expectation of me that I can't fulfill. But so the idea of control is really that sense of perceived stress that most people would use the language around. And there is a perceived stress questionnaire, which is that is used, 14 questions. Sometimes they're shorter ones, but almost all of them start out with, how well do you feel in the control of something? And then you can actually rate somebody, and it's used quite often in clinical research for perceived stress.
So I think, it highlights that it's around a perception of control, a perception of balance, a perception of a sense of harmony in life. Do I feel resistance in doing any of these activities, be it around finances, relationships, activity, health, etc. Looking at and going further then around stress, you mentioned that it's certainly around part of a triangulated approach of various different body systems in the body, and you referred to the HPA axis. Can you tell us a little bit more around how the body experiences stress? And there's clearly stress which is key for our survival, and one of the things that I often reference is, think about that moment when you wake up in the middle of the night and you nudge your partner, or you're lying there in bed wide awake and you're on, because you think somebody's outside. And the heart goes, and there's a flood of change in the body. And I can sympathize that. And then you get to that point of almost panic because your heart is beating so loudly you can't hear clearly anymore. And then your perception of what's happening around you changes, and you're quickly going to, do I need to get up? Do I need to reach the phone? Do I need to do something? That stress response is okay. But the stress that we're kind of concerned about is the continued exposure, the burning exposure of stress, and how that changes our body systems. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two levels of the stress response. The one that you just mentioned now is what we call the fight or flight response. It happens almost immediately, and it's really more around the production of adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that happens almost instantaneously, and that's intended to get our heart rate up, intended to get our breathing up, intended to allow us to flee, fight, or whatever. And that's one component, and obviously that's an important component. And that actually, we can talk about later, that actually it changes the way that we perceive an event, which affects our memory of the event. And then we have the HPA axis, which most people view as, triggering cortisol, or, that part of it. And when you think of that component of the HPA axis, the language I'm using more recently is it's an energy management system. Because if you think about what the stress response is designed to do, it's designed to mobilize energy to survive an event. So it mobilizes amino acids and glucose and fatty acids and allows you to begin structuring your metabolism to solve what's supposedly a metabolic crisis. The problem is, and for instance, if you begin exercising, that triggers the HPA axis, because you're physically active, and it's going to now manage that as a stressful event. The problem is we trigger the HPA axis in humans without any need for a physical response. Meaning, if I'm in the grocery store and I see someone that I don't want to talk to, all of a sudden I have initially a fight or flight response, and then all of a sudden my HPA axis kicks in. But I'm not going to run. I'm not going to use up that energy, but I am still going to mobilize the energy, the glucose, all of these factors, but I'm not going to physically need them. And so we might have this constant sense, and this idea of chronic stress, where you have a stressor that triggers the same response as if you needed to have that as a physical response without a physical need for that energy. And so you have this imbalance. And what happens is eventually that imbalance causes the brain to begin to adapt. It says, okay, I can't handle this elevated cortisol level all the time. Every time I see that person, or I get a call from in the United States, the Revenue Service, or whatever it happens to be. In some cases, for instance, we see this in what we call classic burnout in government employees, in public school educators, in mothers that care for chronically ill children. There's this constant process, but there's no physical outworking. And so the body begins to downwardly adapt. We call it maybe maladapt or maladaption. And now you become less and less able to handle a new stressor. And so this disconnect between what our stressors are and what our physiological needs are creates this problem, especially in the modern world where we have emails and social media and all of these things that are new, and they're constant, they're never ending stressors, really create a difficulty in the body to adapt. And so we end up maladapting, which has its consequences.
Wow, a lot of stuff in this episode. Be right back into it. I want to share with you a little bit about memoryhealthmadeeasy.com and what you can find over there. Programs, resources, and community, all with one goal: to help stop avoidable memory loss. Here's a great place to start. The Memory Health Checkup shows you how to identify your personal risks and also set a map and course about what to do about them. The Memory Health Fast Masterclass gets you out of the gates quickly around applying the 9 principles for memory health for life. Want to work out your brain? Improve your brain performance with How to Train Your Brain. It's a 30-day brain optimizing program. And of course, we've got our flagship community, which is all about support, and you can ask me any question, where I'm your memory health coach to guide, support, and cheer you through the steps to achieve memory health. Come on over to memoryhealthmadeeasy.com/products where you can find out more. Now let's get back to today's episode.
I think of, with some of my clients that I've worked with, that the experience of dementia in a family unit where there is a carer who is caring for somebody who is experiencing cognitive changes, thinking for them essentially and safeguarding them in through life, that there is also a higher experience of cognitive decline in carers who are caring for somebody with cognitive decline or dementia. And we can see, under this lens, that there is a clear line of sight about potentially a strong association with increased HPA axis activation, so that they're in the sustained on mode in terms of that stress mode to pick up, respond, and manage what's happening for that person, and yet there is a consequence to that person's body systems. Can you talk us through what are some of those headline sort of changes that start to occur when we're in a sustained stress activation mode?
Well, when you have this chronic stress, and let me just go through the four main stressors. We talked about perceived stress, and that's a big one. Anytime you have glucose going up and down, hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia becomes a stressor or a stress responder. Inflammation, we think of cortisol, which is the energy management. We think of it's glucocorticoid, it manages sugar, but it also is the body's main anti-inflammatory. So any inflammation that occurs in the body is going to eventually trigger this response, as well as changes circadian rhythm. We don't have time to get into it, but one of the ways that the brain signals the cells to stay on 24-hour cycle is to use the HPA axis. And so there's this, anytime you're jet lagged or you're not sleeping right, the HPA axis is trying to compensate for that. So all of those things are going to the brain and really creating a signal. And again, like I said, it's trying to recruit resources. So it's going to, long-term stress reduces bone mineral density, reduces or increases insulin resistance, reduces insulin sensitivity. It, as we know, reduces neuroplasticity. We can actually look in the brain. It reduces the size of the hippocampus. So you can look at almost every physiological function in the body is in some way downregulated or diminished with chronic stress. Mitochondrial function is, and we're talking mostly chronic stress. Acute stress, if it's resolved quickly, actually begins creating an adaptability to stress. Whereas chronic stress, we start losing that adaptation. And so those are the kind of things that just some of the list of things that we could list. But I would say almost, it's hard to probably put any chronic physiological process that isn't affected by chronic stress.
Yeah. How do we get off this train of chronic stress? If the locomotive is powering down to the next train station, and it is, it's approaching that bridge essentially, which is now rather rickety, and it's going to fall over at some point, where there'll be a manifestation of an event which halts us. It might be a cardiac issue, it might be a sugar regulation issue, so you might experience diabetes. It might even see an event around deteriorating cognitive function. How do we get off this train that keeps chugging along, especially within context with this life, this experience of modern life, which I think, I can think of that seminal book of Alvin Toffler years ago in the 1950s, 60s, who came up with the term future shock, that things are happening of a greater and greater rapidness. Change is happening so frequently that there is going to be experience of future shock. And he obviously spoke about that from a fairly philosophical perspective. But what you're illuminating is a biological, physiological, and from my experience, a functional change in an individual should they
Right.
sustain this course of action. How do we get off this?
Well, I mean, that is the magic question. And I think, reality hits us at different ages. I mean, obviously at some point our buffering systems give way. And, oftentimes when we're in our 30s or our 40s, we finally realize that's when people finally come to the realization. How do you get them to come to the realization earlier? We spend a lot of time self-medicating. So if you think about all of the recreational use of drugs or caffeine or, watching movies, just kind of distracting ourselves. We're in this chronic mode where we're on, and then we're off. And I mean, I think it's a culture. It's a culture thing. I have 6 of my own children. So and they're at various ages from about 24 down to 12. And so, we're trying really teaching your children. What I say to people, if you can teach your children how to deal with stressors, how to deal with life without reaching necessarily for all of these other ways of relieving that pain or relieving that discord that they have, really teaching them how to do that. That's a big, huge area. Obviously, dealing with glycemic control, we have a huge problem with, let's say, medicated eating, where we use salt and fat and sugar, which actually does, in a sense, medicate the HPA axis. It actually reduces some of these stress hormones. But unfortunately, when you combine chronic cortisol with, that kind of eating, it then creates its own problem, and it's a never-ending cycle. It increases inflammation, it increases dysglycemia, and then you have the problem all over again. And what happens, like I said earlier, is the HPA axis says, okay, I give up. I'm going to downregulate. Now, in patients with PTSD, this happens very quickly. They completely shut down. They have low cortisol levels, high DHE, because they're trying to protect their brain from excessive cortisol. But this happens slowly over time with chronic stress as well. And so we have this dampening or, this effect that then doesn't allow us to really live life like we should be, because the brain is saying, I want to protect you from stressors. So I'm going to make you, I want to use the word depressed, but I'm going to keep you protected. So it's going to maybe look like depression, or it's going to look like, cloistering yourself off away from everyone, because it's to protect you from new novel stressors. Well, and then people maybe want to medicate themselves to create a disinhibition. So we're doing this to ourselves, and we need to recognize it as early as possible and live. That's why lifestyle medicine is so important to me, because it really touches upon all of these things.
The thing that strikes me around the concept of, not so much the concept, the philosophy, and also now the emerging education and evidence base around lifestyle intervention, lifestyle medicine, is that it's still not in the hands of folk, be it the layperson, nor is it in the hands of the clinician. And I think around my community that I connect with, that it is still such a foreign concept to think of the 7 pillars, the 7 elements of lifestyle synergy model that you've referred to today, that it's not something that they go to. For example, if somebody presents with a stroke, and you'll have a variety of different team members, but it will all be probably pivoting around an outcome to achieve functional recovery, movement of arm, movement of legs, being able to get out of the chair, can I dress myself, getting out of the car, up and down stairs. Yet it hasn't gone into the space and the realm of optimizing recovery and looking at risk reduction into the future by looking at those areas around the lifestyle factors that are being neglected. I had a wonderful conversation with a gentleman, Bill Cassianis, who sadly has been 4 times affected by stroke. And through his journey, he described where he thought prior to his first stroke, he lived a relatively healthy life. He was active, he had all these things, but what really came up to him was a big stop sign to say, you are running the stress red light here. You have a number of lifestyle factors that have increased your risk, and it's culminated with your genetic risk to express as having a stroke at a young age of 38. Since then, he's gone on a journey of personal discovery, information, etc., by connecting with folk much like yourself and folk that work in lifestyle medicine spaces to gather the tools and personal resources to make change. I think there's a real issue here around how we start to get a simple model into people's hands to take control of personal daily decisions, habits, routines that enable them to reduce their risk for chronic disease later in life. What do you see as some of the key things that to try and get traction in this space, Tom?
Well, as an educator, I believe a lot of it is in the education. When I talk to clinicians, I use what we used to call the old PDR, the physician's desk reference, that would have every drug and every mechanism. And when clinicians think of a therapy, a drug therapy, let's say, they immediately understand the mechanism. They understand it, affects this receptor, it does this activity, and they feel comfortable because they've been taught. That's the kind of the new way they've been taught. And actually, patients now around the world have been taught about disease mechanisms and drug interventions. But if you ask the doctor, how does the Mediterranean diet work, or how does let's say a certain vitamin or herb or something, how does it actually work? They would maybe scratch their heads and say, I don't know how it works. And so what happens is when you understand the mechanism, you have more confidence in that therapy. And so what I try to do is then that's why I talk about these as signals and talk about actually the mechanism for how vitamin D turns on or turns off genes that creates this effect, let's say, on the immune system, or adaptogens. We try to understand some of these adaptogen herbs. How actually do they function in modulating, let's say, these things called heat shock proteins that modulate receptors in the body. And as soon as I start explaining some of these things to clinicians and eventually to patients and broader individuals, say, I know how this works, and so therefore I'm going to give it longer. I'm going to try it, realizing that, like you said, individuals, they don't respond equally to drugs as another. They also won't respond equally to a Mediterranean diet versus a low carb diet or different sorts of things. And when we start understanding that there's individuality, we realize that, there's a lot more that they can do. And really the empowerment of the patient, most, like when I say to somebody, 50 tons of food go into your mouth, you choose almost all of that. How are you choosing? Because all of those signals, all of those phytonutrients, all of those sugars or fibers or all those things are going to be changing your body day by day. What are you choosing to put in there? You have the greatest power than any clinician. Unless you're eating exactly what they're telling you every day, you have way more power to decide how your health is going to turn out than a clinician. Now, they can help prioritize. They can certainly point out areas where you're deficient or need pinpoint therapies, but you have that power. And that's really, I think, the message that we need to sort of reverse from the sort of the idea that medicine-based. I always say we don't follow evidence-based medicine, we follow medicine-based evidence. And so most of our evidence is based on drug models. So we need to start getting out of that and thinking more broadly about what really creates health and disease.
I heard a wonderful conversation about the team at the Cleveland Medical Center, and they have established a functional medicine clinic there, and they described that their initial intake of numbers had rapidly increased, where their demand for service was astronomical, and their waiting list blew out into the thousands of folk wanting to come into the clinic. And they designed a group-based model where folk were coming into the clinic. They would go through some key assessments early on to get their personalized data, but then they would drop into a supported education model around understanding the power and opportunity available in their lifestyle choices. They went through that program, and the primary goal for many folk coming into to that environment was to connect with the specialist to help fix their particular problem. And what they found was that of all the folk that go through that model from their base level data when they come in, their bloods, pathologies, etc., and they go through that lifestyle intervention program for a period of time, they're redoing their bloods, they're redoing their analysis at the end and seeing significant change across the board on their biological markers, so much so that only 25% then need to go and connect with a specialist.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm actually very familiar with a group at Cleveland Clinic, IFM's thing there. So it's amazing. It's frustrating even for them to figure out a way to, because they're being asked to monetize or figure out a way that, what are you saving in the big picture? And it's very difficult because our system isn't set up to capture the saving of not using a drug or the savings of not needing a surgery. Or so they're wildly successful, but still having trouble figuring out how to connect that with a broader view of medicine in the United States, the way it's practiced today.
Right. And if you're looking at the HPA axis, when we come back to that process and how that's working away in our body, is there some simple things that you think folk can take away to try and nurture that? Clearly responding and being attentive to our perception of how we're traveling in daily life. If you're early on and experiencing that, and you put that up, how am I, just doing a little check-in with myself, am I feeling overwhelmed with A, B, or C aspect of my life? It might be finances, might be relationships, etc. What would be helpful action that doesn't require too much understanding, but can be very simple but effective for folk to start to do? What do you see as some of those sort of strategies?
Obviously, I have actually some of it in the original prescription in the stress chapter where I talk about asking those specific questions about relationships and finances and, kind of going down a list of the classic. You can actually download a perceived stress questionnaire online and just do one of them and see where you come in. There's two different kinds. One that I mentioned is the PSS, which is, where you ask the question about control and you can actually just score it. The other one is what we call a life inventory or a stress inventory. And this is, so the perceived stress tells you about their perception. The other one tells you about the events. So, moving, changing in relationships, sudden changes in finances, up or down. And so there's a whole list of things, and those typically graded on sort of how big a life change those are. There's an acronym called NUTS, N-U-T-S. Things that are novel or new, things that are uncontrolled, like I mentioned before, things that threaten us or give us a sense of disequilibrium. So think of anything that's new in your life. Think of anything that you feel out of control. Those are the areas you should be asking, okay, what can I do about those? What can I do to reduce the stressor? I mean, people think of, public speaking. Well, public speaking is an event. To some people, it can be the most stressful thing they've ever done. To another person, it can be something very exciting. So it's not the event, it's the perception of that event for the individual. And so, and I would say this, probably one of the greatest barometers of the stress response is one question: how are you sleeping? If you're sleeping well, you can adapt to stress in a much better way. If you're not sleeping well, probably one of the reasons is you haven't dealt with stressor. So there might be other things, especially in older individuals with other factors of pain and whatnot. But when you're dealing with somebody under 50, sleep is probably one of the things that, and this is true of memory too. If somebody is not sleeping regularly, it's going to affect everything. So that was probably one of the first areas I would start with anybody is sleep, because if you can't regulate sleep, it's going to be very difficult to deal with any other stressor.
Yeah, Tom, I've heard a couple of things there, but obviously a key point there around stress, around sleep, but also perception. working on our perception and interrogating our view of what is happening in our lives. And if
Right.
things are feeling overwhelming and we can't reframe that, we can't move into a different observation of that experience, then sometimes there is distance required, or separating or giving some space around that, or elongating time. Give myself more time to process this. Give myself more, rubber band. Coming back to the rubber band concept, give myself some more elasticity around this experience. And I think that's some of the helpful things. And I can't underestimate too some of the evidence around cognitive behavioural therapy, which is when we've got entrenched perceptual experiences, perception of experiences, then we need to do some reframing and developing skills in our cognitive perception of life. And working in that space can help also, can it not?
Right. And I think people don't realize that they have options. For instance, a lot of people find doing their finances extremely stressful, especially if they're not good at it or their finances. One doctor told me the best advice he ever gave to a woman dealing with chronic disease was to get a financial advisor, because it was this constant pressure that she was having all the time. And so there are other options. If somebody writes down what are the top 10 things that are stressing your life, someone could easily say, well, these 3 things you shouldn't even be doing, or these things you could easily offload to someone else. But because they grew up, and a lot of times we do what we've been told, or we do what we pattern after what we've learned from others. And if our parents didn't do things well, or families or the people around us didn't cope with stress very well, or didn't deal with this, guess what? We repeat that. The sins of the father or whatever pass on to the children. Well, the mistakes or whatever, the stressors of one generation pass down to the next. And so we need to be thinking outside of the box when it comes to dealing with this. It's not just cortisol or epinephrine or these kinds of things. It's really all of these things. So if you're perceiving an event as stressful, it's not just about medicating or taking something, as a medicine. It's really dealing with why is that a stressor to begin with.
You mentioned something around the intergenerational aspect there, and it's part of our conversation that we probably haven't touched on today, but maybe if we could loop in here around, clearly there's an environmental response, our response to the environment, our response to things that are occurring, and that is being interpreted in signals inside our body. We obviously have information around how our body builds itself, how it interacts with other elements, and that's based on our genetic information. What are you, in your work, have you identified around some of those genetic risk factors? And then perhaps to that, what are some of those things that are being, that epigenetic risk factors as well, those things that are being turned on or off in regards to, and I guess that comes into the signaling element of your work. But I'm curious around, for folk to be a little bit more attentive if they go deeper in their journey on how am I, who am I, and how am I interacting in this world? Well, I can take some really easy steps by looking at my sleep, about what I eat. And we had a wonderful conversation with Scott Anderson recently around psychobiotics and the relationship of what we eat being translated into our mood and those signals. And I guess we've unveiled around the 7 elements of the lifestyle synergy model, but coming down to the unit, the information structure of who we are and our genetics. Are you observing those folk that need to be a little bit more attentive to stress because of their risk factors that they've inherited from mum, dad, grandparents, etc.?
So that's a really big issue. And in the research area right now, looking at the influence of as many aspects of what your question details, the epigenetics of the stress response. We know that, for instance, early life stress can be a strong imprinting on the later stress response, metabolically, as well as the ability to deal with new stressors. Young children are very vulnerable to stress events that then will really create a adaptation or a maladaptation within the stress response that I don't want to say it's irreversible, but it's very difficult from a research standpoint to figure out how to unwind all of those things. Because remember, the stress response adaptation thinks it's protecting the organism. It's going to change these kinds of things. And we don't, there's too many complicating factors, but I'm very interested in hormone DHEA as a counterbalancing beneficial hormone. It actually is very good for memory. Interesting. It counterbalances the effects of cortisol in the brain for memory and metabolic conditions. Well, we know that as we age, DHEA declines, and so people think that has an effect. But early on, when we're born, we make no DHEA. Like I said, I don't have time to get into it, but actually, we fetal as a fetus, we actually produce lots of DHEA. When we're born, there's a part of the adrenal gland that goes away, what's called a fetal zone, and the zona reticularis, which is the part that produces DHEA, doesn't mature until we're 9 or 10 or 11 or 12, and that's when we start making DHEA. So there's this window of time in the first 5, 6, 7 years of our life that we're not making this protective hormone, and I think that's part of the reason why that's such a vulnerable time for stress. Now, there may be other reasons, and I haven't really worked out all the details. Part of the problem with understanding how the adrenal gland works is the animals that we typically do research on, rats and mice and rabbits and things like that, don't make DHEA in their adrenal gland. They make it in their gonads. So we don't have a really good model to figure out what is actually going on there. And I think that DHEA and the cells that make it are very vulnerable to stress and create sort of this chronic, the early burnout, let's say, of the HPA axis. It could be accelerated because of damage to the tissues that make DHEA. But other factors, like you mentioned epigenetics, people are looking into this. The receptor for cortisol is very interesting. We're not certain exactly what genetics or what changes to that affect over time. But this is something actually I'm working is, I've got this textbook on stress, and this next year in 2020, I'm going to be making a second edition. And so I'm going to be expanding and asking these questions that I didn't ask the first time around when I put the first edition on.
Tell me, it's very clear that our conversation today has outlined there are key areas folks can focus on to start making changes in their lives around building up their resilience and also their tolerance to interpret signals and then create health and obviously prevent or reduce their risk for disease. We've dived into one of those domains about improving our stress response and our resilience to stress in a couple of strategies, and we've touched briefly on diet, and we've looked clearly at the role of sleep and our perception. Underlining this is there's an element of our genetic risk factors as well, of which we're starting to really just lift the covers off and looking at those epigenetic markers that we create in ourselves, but also that we inherit potentially from mum and dad as well, and generationally transferred to us. This is a complex picture. This is such a dynamic, moving parts environment. And I guess my concern to where I am today and how I experience and interpret and understand the research, and even looking at the spectrum of information out there from a conservative view through to the, I guess I'm calling the avant-garde, questioning our understanding of systems, is that at the moment, for the majority of content that's being published around what works or doesn't work for, let's say in my space, preventing dementia, preventing memory loss, still has a very mechanistic, singular, binary view of if we move this lever, does it work? And we're looking for a response. And I think the failure of many of our approaches has been that we're not looking at how many levers need to be moved, especially when we're further down that diseased, influenced state, that we require significant, if we're going to stop the dam from leaking, we're going to have to put a lot of reinforcement, a lot of boulders in place to help prevent that flow of water downstream. And at the moment, we're just dropping a couple of pebbles in to say, does that work? And I think that's the failure of currently a lot of the work in this space. What I'm encouraged about is to see work like the finger study, which came out of Finland, which looked at a multimodal lifestyle intervention strategy, and they're now showing in a randomized controlled way many years ago that there was a significant reduction in people's risk for progressing to severe memory loss, and even in folk with mild cognitive impairment, which is fantastic. But I don't see enough of that, and I still see a lot of that work. What's your experience and observation at the moment around that evidence landscape in this regard?
As I mentioned earlier, the idea of evidence-based medicine versus medicine-based evidence. Most medical research has been formulated to fit a model to approve the approval model. We want to approve this drug, we want to approve this there, or a guideline. So it's all narrow focused on one variable so that we can tell if that one variable we can approve it, or it's better than the other variable that we have, so that we can say it's better than this, so that we can then authorize it to be used for whatever therapy. So unfortunately, that may or may not be a good model for approving a drug, and we don't want to get into that as a discussion now, but it certainly is not a good way to understand a complex system like stress response or memory or diabetes or any of these large chronic metabolic diseases are not conducive to boiling down to one lever, like you mentioned, because there are so many factors, and the stress response and memory even more so because there's an adaptation. So it's not like a constant up or down. As soon as you turn something up, other things start turning down. You see changes, and the stress response and let's say, to get into this more clearly, the cortisol sensitivity of the brain versus the liver versus adipocytes, fat cells, could be different at the same time in the same person. So what we're learning is these very narrow ways of viewing things are really not very good at understanding how complex chronic diseases progress or how can then reverse them. And throwing something like the microbiome in, which over the last 10 years is now kind of we're realizing that any therapy you take orally is not just affecting you, it's affecting the gut microbes, and then there's multiple layers there. So I think research models and grants for research models are beginning to slowly change to realize that systems like systems biology or systems effects need to be taken into consideration as we start looking at these chronic diseases. Whether or not the regulatory bodies here in the United States, the FDA or PGA or whatever, are going to catch up to that anytime soon. They usually lag behind at least a decade. So we typically aren't going to see them catching up to realize that this is probably the way we should be thinking about therapeutic interventions approval, because the scientists are already catching up, but they still have to shoehorn things into how the regulators are going to judge their research. And that's still going to be a problem, I think, for a while going forward.
Okay. Tom, to close our conversation today, and it's been so rich and detailed, and I'm so thankful for your time. If you had the opportunity to say something to the lay person, the person in the street, the person who's listening to this conversation today, and they're in a point in their life where they turn up to listen because they want to reduce their risk over time for memory loss. They're concerned about their cognitive fitness for life, and they want to maintain that moving forward. What would you say as a takeaway sort of statement for them? And I'll also include the second part of this, thinking about the health professional. What would you hope for them to start to move towards or consider in their work with clients as well?
I mean, I would tell people that your destiny is in your hands, in the decisions that you're making, that whether you think you have we say DNA is not your destiny, that your genetics, that the healthcare system should not be dictating whether you're healthy or not. You have whatever cards you've been dealt, or whatever things have happened in your family or in your life. You have the ability to optimize your health as best it can be based on whatever your circumstances are. You have that ability. You can empower yourself to do that, and don't let other people pigeonhole you or put a disease on you and say that that's what your destiny is. For a healthcare professional, I somewhat say the same thing. I would say believe in the power of your patient to transform their own health, be a cheerleader and a champion for them, as well as help them discover and prioritize those things that are the greatest levers. So, rather than overwhelming them with the 50 things they can do, help them prioritize the 3 things they can do, and then really show them how to do that. Not just tell them, not just send them home with a prescription, but really empower them to be able to do it. And I think the physician will feel much better about the outcomes of what they're doing if they do that. It doesn't mean they won't ever prescribe a drug or a surgery or other things like that, but I think the outcome will be much, much more satisfying for them and, of course, and their patient.
Yeah, wonderful. Tom, how can folk get into your work? How can folk grab your information? How can folk stay up to date with your work and also your learnings as you continue to progress on your journey in investigating this space?
Well, the best way is just with our website, pointinstitute.org. If they go there, I'm kind of reviving some of the things on there, but all the books are on there. And of course, for the people where you are, we have we've just uploaded ebooks. Just 2 weeks ago, we've just put all our books available as ebooks because it costs a lot of money to ship them overseas. We do ship them quite frequently, actually, to Australia and New Zealand. But now those people hopefully will start accessing the ebook and PDF. I do have white papers that I've written. Again, some of this material is designed for, let's say, the healthcare professional audience, but most of it is still accessible to, you've read the roadmaps and you kind of know it can be read by the lay person who's really interested in this topic. Certainly the original prescription is designed for anyone and they can download that. But I have white papers, and we're going to start doing more on our website to keep people informed on things that I'm doing. Hopefully I'll be invited soon to over to your neck of the woods again, and maybe I'll have a chance to speak with some of the people there.
Oh, Tom, I'd love to introduce you to some folk over here for sure. And if you do get the chance to come, you're more than welcome to jump into our community here, and I'd love to connect you here.
I would love it.
Next year, in fact, I'm talking to an audience who are focused on Parkinson's disease, and I've proposed that my particular work and presentation will be pivoting around how can we look at lifestyle interventions for folk impacted by Parkinson's disease, and why we need to be thinking about it much earlier in the continuum rather than waiting for significant progress of that disease before we get involved. And before I see a lot of referrals come to us, we need to be at the front end as much as possible, and as we can continue to beat the drum on this, and getting people's awareness of what the opportunities are, the better. Tom, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to post on our webpage at Memory Health Made Easy. I will include Tom's links and Tom's page there at the Point Institute, particularly for some of these resources. For folk that are interested to start with Tom, I can thoroughly recommend the original prescription. It was the book I started with, and it is still well thumbed and underlined and circled quite frequently on my behalf. So it's a great place to start. And then, of course, there's a lot of the more focused work around specific conditions, and especially the stress and the role of the HPA axis. Tom, thank you very much. I'm grateful for your contribution today to this conversation. It's been excellent.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope to talk to you again in the future.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
In today's show, we've spoken about stress particularly. We've dived deep onto stress and how it has a down-regulation in our body, in the signals that are being created, that there are changes in the way certain body structures and systems perform and work. I want to draw out that there is a relationship between stress and it does impact our memory. It affects an area called the hippocampus. In a critical review conducted by Kim and Associates, they observed that behaviorally, human and animal studies have found that stress generally impairs many hippocampal dependent memory tasks. So the things that are active and engaging and using part of the hippocampus are impacted. And they see it structurally. Human and animal studies have shown that stress changes the neuronal morphology, how things are set up, their shape and size of the neurons. It suppresses neuronal proliferation, so it's stopping that growth, that dendritic or spidery-like tentacle type growths out of the neurons to create better connections. And it reduces the volume, the thickness, the grossness of the hippocampus, and therefore perhaps representing a reduced ability to connect and have a robust and resilient memory, a deep and rich memory. So a memory is certainly under attack, so to speak, when stress is in full flight. So what is the hippocampus? Well, whilst it does sound like the camp for hippopotamuses, the hippocampus lives near the amygdala in the midbrain, and it's a central organ for learning. This structure enables us to convert the content of working memory, where new information is held briefly in the prefrontal cortex, into long-term form for storage. This neural type symphony, this neural act, this neural behavior is the heart of learning. Once our mind connects this information with what we already know, we will be able to bring the new understanding to mind weeks or years later. That is essentially the heart of memory. Our ability to recall information that we've experienced or our experiences and behaviors. What is under threat? What is under threat by stress is this orchestra of behavior, this highway in integration and development and fine-tuning, this dynamic behavior of our brain. And this organ of the hippocampus is impacted by stress, and that appears to be a central observation of how stress impacts our performance. There's a lot under the hood here. There's a lot that's mechanistically discussed, but for you and I, the best way to observe it is that stress threatens our memory. Stress and the stress-related hormones compromises our neurons, the working units of our hippocampus, to withstand. They lose their buffering, and that's much like what Tom discussed in today's show. It loses the buffering capacity, the resilience, the physiological toughness to deal with these changes when they are bathed and exposed to these hormones for too long. So what we then see is that our behavior changes in our memory performance, and that's why we need to be mindful of our cues, mindful of our stresses, and to take action against them, because they do, these exposures do translate into signals in our body, and they can either be for health or they could also be for disease. I'm Dave Norris. Thanks so much for listening to the Memory Health Made Easy podcast. Today's been a rich conversation, and I look forward to hearing about what your experiences in the show are. You can connect with us at Twitter or at Facebook under Memory Health Made Easy, and we can continue a conversation there. But I'd love to find out how this show has affected your life. If you're interested in learning a little bit more or want just a simple compass around lifestyle factors for reducing your risk for memory loss, you might be interested in the 9 factors for memory health for life. It's a free downloadable cheat sheet that I've put together on our website, memoryhealthmadeeasy.com. Go there, grab it, and it's yours to apply in your life. And it gives you a little bit of strategy on what you can do. And that could be a great first step on taking control of your health. I'm David Norris. This is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, and I'm super grateful for your attention. And I look forward to sharing more great conversations with you soon. Thank you so much. The purpose of Memory Health Made Easy podcast is to educate and to inform. It is no substitute for professional care by a doctor or qualified professional. This podcast is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or personal professional advice or services. Instead, we would encourage you to discuss your options with a healthcare provider who specializes in your particular needs.